Discussion topic for today is free markets and Islamic moral economy, complementary or contradictory. This discussion will delve into the intricate relationship between free market principles and Islamic ethical frameworks, exploring whether these economic models can coexist harmoniously or are fundamentally at odds. Our distinguished panelists will examine the alignment of free market policies with Islamic teachings, assess the moral boundaries of capitalism through an Islamic lens, and discuss the optimal balance between market freedom and state regulation in Muslim-majority societies. This dialogue aims to provide nuanced insights into the potential synergies and tensions between economic freedom and Islamic moral imperatives. Now, I would like to proceed to introducing our first speaker. Ms. Shakira Teh Sharifuddin is currently a part-time PhD candidate in Sociology of Education at the University College London, UCL, undertaking a qualitative study on meritocracy, class reproduction, and transformation at elite government boarding schools in Malaysia. Just a fun fact, Prof. Nazari also went to an elite boarding school, MCKK. A fun fact. Prior to that, Shakira obtained her master's degree in public administration from Columbia University, New York. She is also a senior economist with the People Human Development Vice Presidency at the World Bank Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Finance Hub in Kuala Lumpur, where she currently looks at issues related to female labor force participation, childcare provision, social protection, as well as issues related to learning loss and recovery, and adult skills assessment. She was previously part of the macroeconomics, trade, and investment global practice at the World Bank, where one of her main responsibilities is leading the publication of one of the bank's flagship reports, the biannual Malaysian Economic Monitor, and the report on Malaysia's aspiration to be an high-income country. Prior to joining the World Bank, Shakira worked as an economist at Bank Negara Malaysia in the monetary department. She was also briefly attached at the International Monetary Fund (IMF) in Washington, D.C. Without further ado, please take the floor, Shakira.
Thank you very much, Natusha. Assalamualaikum, everybody, and good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, Gerak Budaya, for having me. And I must say, this is very much a new area for me. So I was a little bit surprised when Natusha reached out to me a few weeks ago. But I thought this could be an opportunity for me myself to learn more about the topic. But also having the opportunity to talk a little bit more about things that I may not be able to discuss in my normal professional work setting. So I think Ali did a very brilliant job in presenting the context of his books, the content, and what are some of his ideas that he wanted to present. I think personally for me, what I would like to do, and I've been fortunate enough to be given the first pass at the mic, is probably present a little bit more about the state of play or the background in which we are operating, the kind of economic setting that not just Malaysia, but globally, what are we looking at, or in what kind of economic framework that we are operating in. And I think in that discussion, it's very much framed, the way in which economic policies, economic thinking currently is framed is within the very much neoliberal and capitalism settings. And so on that point, the first thing I would like to say is, I think in terms of how economics and economic framework is framed in many of our discussion these days is in terms of life satisfaction and economic growth are one and the same. And there's always this talk about, or this idea, this thinking that dominates us, that, the more is better. So a lot of the discussion is about increasing the pie size. Sure, there are times where we talk about how you divide those pie sizes, but more often than not, if you look at a lot of the discussion that policymakers are making, academics are making, is really about how do we generate more in this economy. And that doesn't necessarily align with Islamic teachings and Islamic philosophies itself. And a lot of this is driven by consumerism, and in a way, it's the deficit mindset that there's never enough. And so in doing some of readings prior to this, there's an inventor in the US. His name is Charles Kettering, and I think one of the things he had mentioned before that the way in which businesses operate in a capitalism environment is that the aims of businesses must be organized, must be done in an organized creation of a sense of satisfaction, which means there's always a way in which firms, policymakers, governments have this idea that you always need more, and that very much dominates the way that economic thinking shapes everyday life. So that's my first point. So it's very much a system biased towards preventing people from feeling a sense of enough or sense of satisfaction. And then moving into my second point, I think to this is that this drive, this push towards having more consumerism and this deficit way of thinking is that it becomes a lot more pervasive in our daily lives. So it's not just an economic thinking per se, but think of how it has dominated the way we view, for example, employment, where employment is viewed to be a very big part of your identity, of who you are, rather than just a form of vocation, which if you think about it, there's this concept in Islam called iktisad, in which iktisad and vocation is just, it's a means of calling, it's a means of duty, it's fardu kifaya. But the way in which neoliberalism, capitalism has come into play is that it becomes the one all be all for a person. So you are very much defined by your work and your employment and your identity. And very much anchored, it's very much anchored into a meritocratic way of thinking. That idea that if everybody has to work hard in order to gain what he wants, and obviously in an environment where everything is never enough, there's always a silent push or indirect push to work more, to I guess surrender yourself more in that environment. And it permeates into other things, for example, in education, where people or students are viewed as an engine or as an economic agent, as an employer, as a worker. And so very much of what we do in education, not just in Malaysia, but in many other parts of the world, is how do you turn a worker or a human being into a worker? And that's where it ends, rather than looking at it from a very holistic point of view. And so that has implications as well. I think there's always this talk about productivity when it comes to economic thinking these days. So the irony is, productivity is always being called or being described as doing more things, doing efficiently, working more efficiently. So one of the examples given is you produce more in lesser amount of time. But the paradox is the amount of time that you have now as a result of higher productivity is being invested back to work and to generate more in this economy. Again, fueling that thinking of one is never enough and, going on and on about this deficit way of thinking. And so one of the more unfortunate outcomes of this is that because employment is viewed as a very important element in this economic framework, what gets sidelined is the marginalized group. So since you are viewed, one's value or worth is viewed in terms of productivity, marginalized groups such as people with disability, for example, or the elderly, becomes of less value and creates a lot of stratification within the society itself. So that's my second point. And I guess my third point, as a critique of the environment or the landscape that we are operating in currently, is when you talk about neoliberalism and capitalism, there's the element of colonial legacy. So a lot of this thing comes from the idea of Eurocentrism a little bit, where the West is better and the East is not, and thus we have to follow the thinking of what development or what growth is from a very much Western perspective. And most modernization ideas or theories never take into account of local context or cultural context or traditional context, which is key, I think. If we want to talk a little more about Islamic economic principles and bringing that into the current modern setting is what Ali alluded earlier. So that's my 3 points I have, for example, in terms of framing the landscape of the kind of environment that we are operating right now. Ali mentioned a little bit about, how, the idea of Islamic finance sometimes get a little bit muddled or a little bit too focused or too narrow, and I think that's very much true. And I think one thing that we probably need to think about when we discuss about Islamic economy is that there's a difference between doing things the Islamic way and achieving Islamic values or Islamic goals. And so what I think has happened in modern times is ideas such as Islamic finance, and nowadays you have a lot more Islamic economic ideas such as halal tourism or halal consumerism. It's still very much underpinned by the neoliberal and consumerism idea. So it becomes a tool of consumerism rather than achieving a bigger, broader idea in itself. I think that's something that it's worth discussing and it's worth looking at the moment. So I'm going to stop there. I have other points that we can discuss later, but maybe back to Sure.
Thank you so much, Shakira. I think what you really focused, what I could take away from that was that a lot of the discussions are about scarcity mindset, something we are all familiar with the constant rat race and chase, and of course leading to overconsumption and over a lot of priority over making profits, over there's this phrase I always hear mentioned in economics, the means justify the ends, right? So that is something we can keep exploring as well as we broaden the conversation to the Islamic context. But next, I would like to move to Professor Farid Alatas. Let me just make a brief introduction about him, or not so brief. No, okay, very briefly. Professor Syed Farid Alatas is a professor of sociology at the National University of Singapore. He also once headed the Department of Malay Studies at NUS. And Professor Farid has authored numerous books and articles, including Ibn Khaldun, Applying Ibn Khaldun, The Recovery of a Lost Tradition in Sociology, and Sociological Theory Beyond the Canon. That is among his well-known works. His areas of interest are the sociology of Islam, social theory, religion and reform, intra- and inter-religious dialogue, and the study of Orientalism and decolonial thought. Over to you, Prof. Farid.
Morning, everyone. I'm Sujahtara. So, get right into it. Know the origins of the book of Ali Salman. He kindly mentioned that it's something to do with it. So I'm honored by that. Now, for me, one of the reasons for such a work, or the need for such a work, that presents the principles of the economy, basic principles of the need for that is partly, obviously it is a result of the economic situation that we find ourselves in much of the world. But is also partly a result of the failure of the discipline of Islamic economics. And there is, of course, a difference, that there's a distinction that that Ali makes between discipline of economics and what he means by the discipline of Islamic economics and what he means by Islamic. Distinction has to do with inverted commas for one. But when I speak about the failure of Islamic economics, I'm referring to discipline of Islamic economics, which at best doesn't really tell us much about the actual real world in economic terms, but at worst, which functions as an apology or an ideology for current world capitalist economic system. Hence the need for a work like Dr. Ali's work that attempts to clarify what the underlying principles of an economy should be. So this is, for me, the starting point. And related to that, Dr. Ali does not pretend to present a new science of it. So he's not trying to do Islamic economics as a discipline. Rather, so in other words, he's not doing, I guess, I don't know if it's correct to say, you're not doing positive science. What you're doing is normative economics. You're presenting a vision of what the economy, what principles should underlie an economy, what Islamic principles should underlie economy. Of course, his approach is not simply abstract. He's not dreaming up some principles, Rather, he is looking both at texts, at the historical intellectual legacy of Islamic thought, specifically with reference to the Quran and also to the traditions, or practices or views of the Prophet. He's doing that. But he's also drawing on the experience of Muslim polities of the past. How they had put certain principles into practice. This is very important. For example, the discussion on wakaf. And this is not done enough, actually, by the Islamic economists. Actually, they more or less ignore actual history, actual empirical reality. So I think this is very important. And of course, the result of this work, Dr. Ali's work, is focusing on three principles: principles of ownership, principle of wealth creation, and the principle of circulation, distribution. So when he uses the term Islamic economics, he means it in this sense, underlying principles. Now, there are a couple of points which I think are important to note, in addition to what I just mentioned. Then I also want to make a few critical remarks. Critical in the sense that I feel these are areas that need to be emphasized when discussing the principles of economy. So let me make two more points in terms of observations about the book. Now I think there are many interesting points, but there are two that I'd like to focus on. One is that the book avoids, and I think rightly so, it avoids the view that Islam prescribes a system. Am I right about it? And I think this applies to both the economy and to politics. I agree with Ali that Islam does not prescribe an economic system. It does not prescribe a political system. What it does is to describe principles that underlie a particular economic system. I think it is actually unsound to say that Islam prescribes an economic system. That you have capitalism, you have socialism, and you have Islam. I think this is extremely unsound. It's not in line with the tradition. No Muslim ever tried to actually, in terms of the leaders, the polities, tried to actually create an Islamic economic system. Muslim polities were created within the context, against the background of already existing economic systems and political systems. So you had, more in the time of the Prophet, in Makkah and Medina especially, these were more small, very small, rudimentary states, based, which the production was based mainly on animal husbandry and some of course trade, an international, what we might call international trade, but with with a lesser degree of agricultural production. By the time Islam spread to Iran, by the later days of the Umayyad dynasty and the Abbasid dynasties, the Islam became an agrarian empire, and the nature of production totally changed. It was really agriculture based, and all the economic arrangements with regard to land tenure, regard to relations between producers and owners of land, were completely different from the time of Medina. And in the Ottoman period, especially the later Ottoman period, you again have differences in terms of political, economic arrangements. Now, I can't go into all the details. Well, maybe I mention one more point. You look at the Malay world. You have very different kinds of economies. You had economies that were very much based on water, riverine exchange systems. So you have very different kinds of economies, different kinds of polities that articulated with the economies. The Malay world, you had mainly decentralized systems, what is often referred to as Malay feudalism, decentralized states. But in Mughal India, in, Ottomans, the Safavids, and so on, these were all highly centralized states. So there's no Islamic economic system or even political system, but there were what unites all these systems, different systems in the Muslim world, were the principles. For example, the sacrosanct position of wakaf. This you find throughout Muslim world. We can also identify other aspects that were common, and indeed these are discussed by Ali. So that's one point. The second point is that, and I think this is suggested by Ali. I think I've read it, the work, that what you are calling an Islamic economy based on Islamic principles could either be capitalist or socialist. You are saying this, right? This is something that the simplistic idea that Islam is neither capitalist nor socialist is not accepted by you. That if you have a capitalist system, it can be Islamic if it is founded on the principle. And similarly, one could make an argument for a socialist system, which would be Islamic if it is founded on these three principles. So I think this is also something very important. The current debates actually among Muslims tends to be pro-capitalist. There's little discussion on socialism. But I have also a comment to make about that shortly. Now, a few critical points, which I think don't detract from your argument, but I think if you went into these points, they would enable you to expand certain ideas. Now, the first point has to do with exploitation. That I feel that there should be, when we talk about Islamic principles of economy, there should be a discussion on exploitation. Not just the fact that exploitation exists in the real world, but also what is an Islamic concept of exploitation. The Quran, of course, talks about two groups, mustakbirin and mustadafin. There is definitely a notion of exploitation. And even the term weights and measures appears in the Quran. Al-Mikyal wal-Mizan. And there are at least a couple of places, one or two places, in the Quran which people are warned not to distort or shorten people in terms of weights and measures. So it's a kind of there is a notion of depletion or reduction, which involves, of course, cheating. Now, why am I saying this? Because the German term for exploitation, which Marx used, Ausbeutung, actually means depletion. So it has a very similar meaning to the word used in the Quran, which is tankis, tankusu, which means to deplete, to reduce, to cheat on weights and measures, literally, Quran. Ausbeutung also means, which is in English is translated as exploitation, which means not to give to the worker the full value of what the worker put in the product. So my point is, capitalism being based on exploitation, there needs to be a view that we have based on Islamic principles of exploitation. And I think one way to deal with it is, in order to deal with exploitation in the context of capitalism, since exploitation is primarily founded or based or to be found in the area of production, because it has to do with the relationship between the vast majority of people in the world are working class, work either as agricultural workers, they work in urban sectors as wage earners. The vast majority are producers, and one could argue, has to be argued, that they are not getting the full value of what they put into the product in the form of wages. So if we understand exploitation in this way, it means that to deal with the principles of the economy as you are dealing with, you would have to also deal with the principles of production, not just ownership, and not just wealth creation. Because when you talk about wealth creation, you're talking mainly about trade. At least the examples, historical examples that you use, and the religious texts that you refer to are talking about the context of trade. But there's also the context of production. In our economy today, production is perhaps as, if not more important. Trade is merely the realization of value. So I think this is, for me, a central point, issue of exploitation. So that requires going to the level of production, going beyond circulation to the level of production. And then a few other points. I like your emphasis on freedom. Talk about freedom. And you talk about negative and positive freedom. Now, one issue of freedom which I think is very central to our economy today, the modern world, is not just freedom from coercion, but also freedom to be fully human. It's what, psychologists, the sociologists, the philosophers refer to as alienation. Alienated from your humanity. This is what capitalism does. I will relate something to you. You all have come across it. You all experience it. Sometimes we don't really articulate it, right? Once I went, a few months ago, I missed a flight. I was traveling somewhere. The check-in counter closed at 1 hour before the flight. I arrived 3 minutes late. Not 3 minutes after the flight, 3 minutes before the check-in counter closed. 57 minutes for the flight. And they refused to let me check in. I had no check-in luggage. I just had hand luggage. Could have easily made it to the gate long before the gate closed. But they refused. Now the interesting thing is, first of all, you have this rules-bound system, which is very rigid. But the kind of non-human interaction I had, I was interacting with a non-human. This non-human was simply operating according to the rules. Stone-faced, no expression on her face. And she kept on telling me that I'm late. I kept on telling her, I know I'm late and I'm not blaming you, not absolving myself of any blame. I'm just saying, can you have some compassion and let me go? And I was speaking to the wall. I was speaking to a stone. She did not understand. She could not empathize with me. There's a lack of empathy. Right? This is the world we live in today. And this is a world which is created by capitalism because it is a world in which the capitalist values of efficiency, calculability, predictability have invaded all aspects of life. To the point where we even have the ability to reject a fetus because it may not be efficient. Fetus, we can check through modern medical science, we can check whether this fetus is going to be born with deficiencies, defects, maybe with genetic inferiorities. And then we have the ability, therefore, to reject this child before it is born. Right? So, there are so many. So the thing is, freedom in terms of the ability to regain humanity, um, the freedom to be fully human, that also needs to be discussed. That has an bearing on our attitude towards capitalism and also socialism. I guess I have many other points, but I won't. Why only capitalism or socialism? What about post-scarcity society? I mean, this is an important debate that's been going on for decades. Although people might think it's a new thing, but even Keynes was an advocate of post-scarcity society, and he actually believed that post-scarcity society could actually come into existence in the 20th century. More recently, I think there have been more discussions. In fact, in some ways, we're already in a post-scarcity, right? I mean, it is said that there's enough food in the world to feed 10 billion people, more people than there are actually on the planet. But the distribution problem, right? So in a sense, when in your textbooks, economics is defined as scarcity, we're duped into believing that. It's very ideological, right? So some may make the argument that Islam is closer to capitalism. Others may make the argument that Islam is closer to capitalism. I tend to believe the latter. But I would say that even if Islam were to advocate, or Muslims were to advocate socialism, it is only a temporary thing. Because the end goal should be post-scarcity, where consumerism is no more, where people do not need to work 40 hours a week. Keynes believed that people could actually, if there was full employment, people would only need to work about 15 hours a week, spend the rest of the time developing ourselves as human beings, developing our relation, developing our reality, developing our potential in terms of creative potentials and so on. What would a post-scarcity world look like? This is for a later discussion, but the clue is watch Star Trek. Star Trek is actually a very intelligent working out of what post-scarcity world is. Because there are still people in the universe who are not in a post-scarcity situation. We'll talk about that later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farid. That was very interesting. I didn't expect it to end on the note of Star Trek as a case study of a post-scarcity society. I think that a really great point that you made, besides like your illustrious review of Dr. Ali's book, was also that this gap about studying the Islamic conception of exploitation definitely is something that I'm interested in, even in my own PhD project. And of course, like the need to talk more about the freedom from alienation. But having said that, let's go to our last but not least panelist, Prof. Muhammad Nazari Ismail. Let me just introduce him as well. He's currently the chairman of the Boycott, Divest, Sanction BDS Malaysia. He's also emeritus professor of at the Faculty of Business and Economics, University Malaya, Kuala Lumpur. He was the dean of the faculty until 2015 and headed the university's strategic planning unit in the 90s up to the early 2000s. He's written 5 books now and 6 forthcoming, titled Warmly Yours Forever, which will be about climate change. And I'm very happy to say I had a part in the inception of the book, so stay tuned for that. He's also written another book which is relevant for today's discussion called Till Debt Do Us Apart, which is about the banking industry and how it induces debt in society. He's consulted as well as provided training for multiple public and private sector organizations, including the Prime Minister's Department of Malaysia, Proton Matsushita, the Royal Malaysian Police, and the Malaysian Institute of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators. He was a Fulbright Scholar in 1999 at University of Michigan in the US. a Fulbright visiting specialist at Pfeiffer University, North Carolina, USA. In June 2005, he was a visiting fellow at Oxford Center for Islamic Studies in Oxford University. Professor Muhammad Nazari Ismail obtained his bachelor's in economics from the University of Wales in the UK, followed by an MBA in State University of New York and a PhD from the Manchester Business School, University of Manchester, United Kingdom. Alright, now that was the final introduction. And let's hear from Prof. Nazari.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good morning to everyone. Alhamdulillah rabbil alamin wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulil karim wa ala alihi wa sahbihi. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, the panelists. I want to follow up from the issue of scarcity, abundance, and Ali mentioned just now the problem of distribution. Actually, I will question that because I was involved as an investor in cultural sector, and I asked around and I did some research, read around. When do you know that the farmers in Cameron Islands, when at one point, many times actually, when they produce a lot of stuff, what do they do with the stuff? When they have plenty, they throw this food in the right. This is actually not new in Malaysia, around the world. In the US, it's very well known that farmers destroy crops. They would throw, or they would spill. I don't know what the word is spill, because they were pour maybe milk down the drains, thousands of gallons to destroy, even though they know there are a lot of people who are hungry. Is it because of distribution? Is it because they can't send this food to the poor people around the world? No. Because they want to make sure that the price is maintained. Why do they want to make sure that the price remain high? It's because they will calculate the revenue. And they found out that if the price goes down, their revenue will not be able to cover the expenses, and they'll be in trouble. They'll be in trouble, they'll be financially ruined, they'll be bankrupt. And it's actually a strategy to survive. It's a survival strategy. If they are humanistic, in other words, if the food that they produce are given out to poor people, to others, they will not survive as an organization. Because of what? Because they are financed by banks. And they need to find the money to pay back their loans. And that is more important to them rather than giving food to people. Okay. And that is something which is happening but not understood by money policymakers, and that is why they talk about producing more stuff. Actually, there are already a lot of stuff being produced, but they are destroyed by the farmers themselves. That why, as I said just now, I want to compare during the time business people now and during the time when many years ago, I would talk about during my childhood. Okay, as an example, I went to call it Maghrib market. I don't know how the term here is night market. Actually, it's pasar malam. It's not like that. During the time when I was a child, the farmers, they will come to the market before Maghrib, and then after that they go home. So they will gather a place to sell agriculture produce. I remember I went to this particular makcik. I said I want to buy. My mother asked me to buy some veggies, and then she said to me, she had veggies on the table or on the cloth on the floor, and she said to me, "Don't buy from me, buy from this lady next to me who was also selling the same produce." But she said the reason is why, because hers is more fresh compared to mine. So she said, "Don't bother to buy from me, buy from the lady who is actually according to current terminology, is her competitor. But she asked me to buy from the competitor. Was going to lose revenue. Why was she wasn't desperate? Compared to current world business people, they will spread messages. They say, don't go over there. That's poisonous. That's dangerous. Whatever, right? In order to make sure the people come to them. Why? Why was the business people of the past behaving like that, making sure that the customers, the consumers get the fresh food, and whereas the business people of the current time wants to destroy competitors, wants to make sure that their competitor will be banished from the market. In the case of Medina, for example, as a company that's competing against other hypermarkets, I will tell you why. It's a matter of survival, because Medina is more than 2 billion ringgit in debt. And that is why they find it very difficult to pay minimum wage. 1,500, they complain when the government wanted to increase minimum wage, because they would increase my expenses, and they said, and Medina, the chairman said, we'll be in trouble. Why? Because they are billions in debt, and they are thinking how to pay back. Even now, let me tell you, because bankers told me Medina has got a very bad reputation in terms of finance. Okay, so many companies around the world are in trouble, and they are basically about survival. Okay, survival. Why? Because they are all drowning in debt, and that changes many aspects of policy making, which makes life very complicated, and therefore it's a challenge for economists, especially Islamic economists, to deal with them, because the basic underlying structure of the economy has changed from the time of the so-called real Islam. I'll give you an example of how scholars now, so-called Islamic scholars in the field of economics and muamalat, find it very difficult. Let's talk about exchange rate. Is it okay or not to allow forward market? I don't know, in exchange rate, people can buy currency and deliver in 3 months or 6 months. It's called forward market. There's a forward rate for that. And then the other scholars say that that's haram, because this among ribawi items are currencies. You must deal on spot. You pay and you deliver at the same time. For 6 ribawi items: gold, silver, grains, dates, etc., etc. But the financial experts will tell you, if you do not have forward market and the currency exchange rate moves in 6 months' time, companies will go bust, because dollars have moved, and if it moves in the adverse way, your debt or your expenses can go up a couple of times, and you'll be in trouble. So a forward market is necessary to cover, to address exchange rate uncertainties. So how do Islamic jurists deal with that? How did exchange rate come up in the first place? Why do exchange rate exist? Why do you have dollars? Why do you have yen? Why do you have ringgit? Other currencies. Why? Last time, we didn't need to use currencies, because you take a piece of gold from Europe, you can go all the way to China and other parts of the world, and everybody will accept that. That's a simple system. There's no need to worry about exchange rate fluctuation. But why do you now have a system that is so complicated that you have to have not only forward market, you also need currency swaps? I don't know whether you understand or not. This is all mechanism in order to tackle exchange rate uncertainties. And even that, they can't address it. And you know that you can have all kind of policy making in this country, right? If Trump increase exchange rate, people will be in trouble. All the developing countries will be in trouble, regardless of their so-called economic policies. So the recent appreciation of ringgit and all these government supporters were so excited. These are all function of the dollar and interest rate over there in the US. If it moves in a different way, that's it. Our ringgit will be in trouble. But why do we need exchange rate in the first place? Why do humanity use exchange rate? Why don't you use gold? Which makes it so simple. Okay? I will tell you why. It'll take a long time. I will try to be brief. The reason is because the financiers, the people who dealt with finance, who lent money, were so greedy. They didn't want to use gold because if they use gold as money, then they will limit their business. If they lend money and you use gold as money, if they have 100 pieces of gold and they lend money and charge interest, there's no more money to be lent because all the pieces of gold have been lent out. But these people wanted to lend 1,000 pieces of gold, 1,000 so-called dinar, more than the 100 dinars that they have in hand. That is riba. And what did they do? They started off with paper money, right? They changed it to paper money. And then it grew their industry. And then they found out that this industry is now becoming very dangerous because you are creating more money than the gold that they have, right? So they need a supervisory body to make sure that all these lenders behave responsibly, and that gave birth to the central banks, Bank of England, etc., etc. And then they call their currency, they call the money, because now if you base it on gold, there is not enough gold to cover the currency, which is multiple times more. So they call it yen or British pound sterling. They call it dollars. That way, you don't even know what is the physical amount that is available, that is actually existing. So now they can lend dollars. You know how much is global debt now? More than 300 trillion. So what is it? Last time you said 300 pieces of gold, you can see it. 300 trillion? Well, can you see it? It's not even paper, by the way. If you want to visualize it on paper, it's not even paper. It doesn't exist physically. And can you imagine how much interest they can get on 300 trillion? At 10% is $30 trillion per year. $30 trillion, you convert to ringgit, how much? Okay? Alright. So now, the scholars, the jurists, are expected to deal with it. Actually, the jurists were doing a good job before. And that is the reason why, during the time of Umar ibn Aziz, if the stories are to be believed, and I suspect was true, that they find it difficult to find people to give zakat. Right? This is not hadith or Quran, this is a story. It says that during the time of Umar ibn Aziz, they collected zakat and they find it difficult to give to the poor people because there were not enough poor people. People were all living a good life, and therefore zakat money collected could not be distributed. That was the time of Umar ibn Aziz. And there were no economists at that time. There were no economists. There were only jurists, scholars who explained what is right and what is wrong. There were no economists, but the economy was functioning perfectly. Now you have 70% of Nobel Prize winners in economics in the US, and the US is in big trouble economically. Right? And I remember a comment made by Larry Summers during the time of the subprime crisis. And they lost subprime crisis of 2008. They were in big trouble, right? They were in big trouble because their institution were going bust. All the financial institutions going bust, and if they go bust, the whole economic United States economy will be big trouble. What did Larry Summers, who was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors to President at that time was Obama. He said, this was related by former chairman of Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker. he said, Larry Summers said, we have to be seen to be doing something. Because they didn't have any clue on how to save the system, how to save the US economic system. They have no clue. So they were just having meetings in order to be seen to be trying to do something. But eventually, what did they do? Of course, we found out. One of it was quantitative easing, which is creating money from thin air and then saving the financial institutions. And what about the poor people who were laid off, etc.? Go to the streets and remain in the streets. And that is why you see thousands and thousands of Americans now living in the streets as homeless, or the big cities of America. And that is a country where 70% of the Nobel Prize winners come from. Nobel Prize winners in economics is from America, and you have thousands and thousands of people in the streets, and 17% of the population are poor. So the field of economics is useless. Well, I have a degree in economics, so I can say that. So I used to say that, okay, I study anyway, but not to practice. The field of economics is useless because 70% of Nobel Prize winning economists cannot solve their own problem, their own country's problem. So what? You need are jurists. But the jurists are now being tasked to solve problems which are created by a system that has gone haywire. Give another example. One MDB now owes about, used to owe about 50 billion. And then they started paying, I'm not sure how much is left. But let us say you have a situation where one MDB cannot settle its loans. Malaysia's debt now is 1.5 trillion. In Islam, according to the jurists, if you don't settle your debt, you cannot go to paradise. You have to settle your debts. So again, okay, now let us say Malaysian government cannot settle its debts. It's not uncommon to know about that. Argentina got into trouble 2000, couldn't pay its debt. There were many countries in Africa, highly indebted poor countries, high HIPC, couldn't settle its debts, and you need moratorium, cancel off the debts. Let's say that they can't settle the debts. So now, who will not be able to go to paradise? All the people of the country? The president? Anwar Ibrahim in of Malaysia? Well, he inherited this debt. Najib? He inherited this debt as well. So, who are these people who are not going to be able to go to paradise? YMDB cannot settle the debt? Or some of the I give another example, what is the company now? Cerebral Dynamic. I don't know whether you know Cerebral Dynamic recently. Got into trouble. Couldn't pay 5 billion debt. So who is not going to go to paradise? What about the shareholders? Company is gone now. So ask the jurists. Who's not going to go to paradise then? Public limited companies with thousands of shareholders, billions in debt, creating problem for the jurists to decide now. But why did they come up in the first place? Why did this public organization come up in the first place? Huge organizations, which huge debt. Where did they come from? How did they come into being? Was it necessary? According to Schumacher, I don't remember his first name, the German economist. No, Schumacher. E. Schumacher. I remember his first name is E. Yeah, small is beautiful. He talked about going back to the time when organizations, economic activities are run by small organizations. He said now, he wrote this book in 1970s, right? He said all these large organizations are creating so much unpleasant situation for humanity. Which he wrote this in 1970s, by the way. Yeah? And what happens to and he was talking about, I'll give you an example, is mass production of food, for example, right? By large organizations. So you are eating foods which are processed, because they have to build in large quantities, and also they process it, and as a result, we know now, processed food is one of the main contributors for health problems, right? Cancer, etc., etc. So these large organizations, and you were talking about when they hire people, yeah, they have 50,000 workers. So let us say they are in trouble because some of these people, Toyota have 1 trillion in debt, by the way. Yeah? So if they want to cut costs, let us say 1% or 5% of their employees, they need to do it, otherwise they'll be in trouble financially. How many thousands will be laid off? In Indonesia recently, Skytex, was it? Skytex. Sorry, a textile organization, they were in trouble. They were going to lay off 30,000 people. So what kind of humanity is that? But why did they end up such a large organizations? Why did they listen to Schumacher, who said that small is beautiful? Trace back the origin of the large corporations. Why did they come into existence in the first place? I need to wrap up. Okay, let me finish this story then. Why did the large organization come out in the first place? The so-called corporations. Timur Quran said that this is one innovation which Muslim world emulate. Because we have in the Muslim world partnership. They call it syarakah. We didn't have large corporations. Large corporations where the entity is different from the owners. Huh? And so that when the corporation sued for not paying debt, it's nothing to do with the owners. So it's a separate entity. This concept is new. It's new. That is why one MDB can be in trouble. Najib is not answerable anymore, even though he was the one who helped to form it. Because he's separate from Najib as the Prime Minister. So where did the concept come from? It came from because the bankers want to make sure that the borrowers will continue to live, even though the owners have died. They wanted to lend money in huge amount, right? They wanted to lend money in huge amount, but if they lend it to human beings, the problem is human beings die. So they want the borrower to be an entity that will find it difficult to die. And that's called the large corporations. And that's how it started in Europe, and then spread all around the world. And that's why you have now large corporations which E. Schumacher lamented about. So we have to go back and understand how this evolved. And then we realize actually now, what is the term used? You have that something out of the box and everything gone crazy. Right? A Pandora's box, or you let the tiger out or whatever and gone crazy around the zoo, whatever. now, we are now in a situation where everything has gone crazy, such that you have to go back to basics. And it's not economics per se. It's not economics for me. It's not Islamic economics per se. But the basic value systems, the basic worldview, and understanding the teaching of Islam in its principles. Not to go back there and then realizing many of the institutions, economic institutions and financial institutions and business institutions that are currently operating in the economy are products of un-Islamic failure to obey basic Islamic precepts and regulations, principally about the prohibition of lending profit. That's why I wrote the book, Give That Those Part. Thank you. Sorry for taking too much time.
So thank you, Prof. Nazari. That was very interesting because not only were you explaining or painting the very bleak picture that is in today's economy, but also it kind of touches the point about the failure of the Islamic economics as a discipline, right? Because the problems that we have today are so fast evolving and so challenging that even maybe can our jurists actually catch up, and are they able to provide the answers to such complex situations that we are seeing today? And maybe just to find out each other's response to the remarks made. But before that, because in the interest of time, I don't I'm wondering if there are any questions from the floor. Oh, okay. So there are two questions. Maybe we'll take both at the same time, but please keep your comments limited and focus on giving the question in a succinct way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew. I'm a local lawyer. Three very bullet point questions in response to what I've heard this morning. Firstly, what does Islam say about rent seeking? Because that's a major issue, not just in Malaysia, but elsewhere. Secondly, some of you talked about exploitation. But when we look at the Middle East, we see quite a lot of that going on in terms of migrant labor. You had the problem with Qatar and the World Cup and things like that. So again, what you talk about exploitation, you talk about discrimination. In an Islamic system, in a perfect model, what does it say about this idea of exploiting and discriminating against others on the basis of nationality or citizenship? And then my third very quick question, Ms. Shakira talked about colonialism. And I just wanted perhaps her to comment on the fact that in many situations, it's no longer a foreign colonialism that's operating, but it's an internal colonialism. One class in a society acting or using powers of law and position, relying on perhaps the laws that were given by colonial powers, but continuing to use them to exploit the very people that they are supposed to be representing or helping to improve. Those are my three questions. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Haziq. I'm a second year PhD student at the NUS. Dr. Ali, I wanted to, so I'm very excited to buy and read your book, but I'm still wondering, why do we need to understand economics from an Islamic perspective? I think that part of was sort of, I wish you could expand more on it, because in your presentation, we understood the mechanics and sort of principles of justice. Second question to Dr. Nazari. Again, you've critiqued that and whatnot, but the so what is somewhat missing from how it relates to your to commenting on Dr. Ali's book that was recently published. So I was hoping that you could expand more on it. And finally, it seems that you have this romanticized view of that Islam has these principles of economics that were perfect and all that, but so a return to those days would ensure justice but what makes your critique different from those who critique that, those scholars like Joseph Stiglitz and all that who critique the excesses of capitalism? I'm curious to hear your response. Thank you.
Thank you for I think both questions. I'll take the second question first because it is directly relevant to the topics which I have touched upon in my book. Why do we need to, if I understand your question correctly, why do we need to actually an Islamic perspective, or why do we need to relate this framework with why do we need to understand from economics from Islamic perspective? That was your question. So let me explain my view here. Islam, both as a religion and also as a set of principles, has this unique, I think, identity which directly influence the formation of a state, and it continues to actually influence even today the public policy, constitution, and therefore the understanding. I mean, I would not say that Islam has a singular understanding, because as Muslims and as students of Islamic philosophy or Islamic thought, all of us have certain unique perspectives. So when we say that Islam, I will be careful. I would just say my understanding of the history, other than I would say understanding of the whole Islam. So that is because my work is just a rediscovery of certain institutions which were practiced in the early part of the Islamic civilization.
So that was part one. Why it is relevant? Because as I mentioned, the issues of zakat as taxation, interest, or waqf as an institution, inheritance laws as they were prescribed in Quran, uh, they are still very much relevant to our day-to-day conduct in how we manage our wealth, especially in societies which or countries which declare their legal system or constitutional framework consistent with Islam. And that is true with and there are differences, but that is true with most of the Muslim majority countries. Of course, some countries adopt a more secular framework in which they do not identify Islam as the central pillar of their constitution, like Indonesia. But some countries clearly link it with Islam or an understanding of Islam, like special fiqh, a school of thought like Shafi school here in Malaysia. So there are those differences, but I think the understanding of our history and understanding of these principles as evolved in the history remain quite relevant in the evolution of not just the economic organization, but also the evolution of legislation, policy framework, and constitution. And hence I think it is important to maybe contribute in this way. Secondly, my own intellectual sort of journey. It was one important element has whenever we look at from an academic perspective, you want to be able to like take a stock of literature. What is in the literature? So obviously there is a vast amount of literature of what is known as Islamic economics. So I wanted to take a view of that and I say whether this is an original perspective or there are issues with that. So I write a full chapter on it. So I'll not go detail. So my second inspiration is a critical assessment of that literature, and to what extent it should be linked with the original teachings and principles as espoused by the founders of the civilization. I hope that I answered that. Oh yeah, sorry. The rent seeking. Thank you. I did not address it directly, Andrew. The issue of rent seeking in my framework, but I would like to draw a parallel, which may be to some extent relevant to the question. Let's say, what we mean by rent seeking, first of all. So, for instance, that definition is important. In modern economic context, we define rent seeking as the way I understood it's let's say corporate welfareism, in which certain corporations, business entities, are getting some kind of protection, subsidies, from the government, from the state. This is what I would understand from the rent seeking. Now, if you look at, let's say, I would relate it with the notion of property rights in my framework, and I can share with you that the property rights is a contested field in an Islamic economic framework, because there are some provisions which protect the private property right, and there are no limits of how much you can acquire, either in terms of land ownership or your assets. But also there are limits on the usability of the land. For instance, if you have land and if you are not using the land for productive purpose, according to some legislation, the state can take it back if those resources are not being utilized efficiently for their purpose. So there is a degree of dynamism here. The property rights are not absolutely given as like private ownership, but if it is not used for the overall benefit, then of course it can be taken back. So I think that is the framework from property rights. But as an economist, I maintain that position that government should not be in the business of handing over subsidies or special exemptions to corporates, and it should be based on a competitive market, on on competition. And let's say if there is this notion of like Prof. Nazari was talking about large companies, too big to fail argument. I am of the view that we should aim for we should allow creative destruction in the sense that Joseph Schumpeter used the word creative destruction of such entities and corporates which may be perceived as too significant in an economy, but then it sort of also creates hurdles in redistribution and more efficient uses of resources which they have. So that is my view. I hope that I have answered your point.
Can I comment a bit on rent-seeking thing? Mostly understood, rent-seeking behavior is most understood when corporations try to earn unfair benefit through manipulating contracts with government. Relation with the government, and the government through regulation, through laws which benefit particular organizations. This is what is happening in many countries, including our own countries. That's how people get interested in the rent-seeking concept, because you are benefiting at the expense of the people, and the government is spending billions or wasting money because of this behavior. Now, this concept, this situation of where you have wastage and you have situation of rent-seeking behavior must be understood by the situation of where government now is in a position where they can spend so much money. Why are they able to spend so much money? Is because of the situation where money has now changed its form to become electronic, doesn't exist physically, and then government are allowed by the people to borrow and are in debt. If you have a situation, I want to go back to you can call me, I do not know whether I want to call myself a Salafi economist. I want to go back to the original situation last time. The government was not allowed by the scholars to borrow money. Haram, basically, and then, of course, borrow money and then pay interest. It's not allowed. So, what about for expenditure? Based on what I read by Monzakar, the economist, he said even education is supposed to be the responsibility of parents, not the government. But now you have the government doing everything. And one of the reasons they are doing everything is because they have access to borrowed money, which doesn't exist physically. So you have now a situation where government ends up in debts in the trillions. Let's talk about PTPTN, right? Now, 40 billion, 50 billion. Now, why did the government go there in the first place? Why do they want to be so popular to finance people's education? Let the parents save money and pay for their children's education. But they want to be popular. And why did they come up with the idea of going into this? Because they know they can borrow money from banks, which now is what they have done. They end up in about 50 billion in debt, paying about 3 or 4 billion a year in interest. And then you have manipulation. So the banks are also manipulated. Banks are the worst rent seekers, because by having the government end up in debt in the trillions, banks and lenders I'm talking about, the lenders, they are the ones who are benefiting the most out of it. So, in the first place, why did we allow governments to borrow money and pay interest? Forget about the Islamic concept of suku, etc. They are just also borrowing money and also charging in a halal way, so-called. But for me, it's not halal for me. It's actually manipulating of terms and akad. It's actually lending industry. For me, riba is basically lending industry, making money out of loans. Making money out of loans. And making money out of loans, for me, is riba, regardless of the contract that you try to manipulate. So, now you allow that to happen, and now the government will go and borrow in the trillions, and then you have companies go in there and trying to get manipulating the laws, etc., etc., to get unfair advantage and benefiting. So the latest one is among the latest one, the solar in the Sarawak yang apa ni Rosmah kena tu, the billions. Right? All this behavior comes about because the government is allowed to borrow money in the trillions, as I said, and then you have abuse going on. If you do not allow that, then there is no room for abuse because you have to stick within the money that you have. You don't have enough money, you cannot spend. And then what to do? Then we as population, we help each other. We help each other. But what happens now is we don't help each other. Pass it on to government, and the government will borrow from the lending industry in the trillions and benefiting the elite financial class. So some of these problems that come about has its roots in allowing the industry of lending money and making a profit out of it. A lot of it actually is a result of that. So I think that's my take on it. If you start talking about rent seeking as a technical term, it becomes very complicated. But the whole concept, for me, you will have to go back to the root of it and then look at the Islamic jurists of what is halal and what is haram. Just like the concept of greed. What is Islamic concept of perspective towards greed? How do you define greed? How do you define greed? You see, a lot of problems in society now is because of greed. If somebody is very ambitious as a businessman and he works hard in order to enrich himself, is he greedy? Is he greedy if he does it in a halal way? I would say no. That don't be too fast to blame somebody who is working hard day and night to be a successful businessman to be a greedy person. You go back to the halal and haram. What did he do? What business is he in? Gambling industry? Okay, that is greedy. Is he in the prostitution, a brothel industry? That is greedy. But if he is in the halal, in the agricultural, for example, and he doesn't borrow money from haram sources, why are you condemning him? What is wrong with that? So that concept does not help. What you need to do is look at what the jurists say, what is allowed and what is not allowed. Because the jurists allowed, not the jurists, the society allowed the growth of the lending industry, and that is why we have a problem now for the jurists, because he has to tackle a problem which is an outcome of the basic disobedience in the first place. So that is why I mentioned just now about corporations. The existence of corporation which create a lot of problems. The large corporation is an outcome of the system that allows the lending industry to grow. If you are a small company, I've got Hati Strategy Management, if you are a small company in the business world now, you are going to find it very difficult to survive. It's like you are a sportsman in the athletics. If you allow steroid in athletics, everybody must take steroid. Because if you remain clean, you will never get gold medal. Because all the other athletes are using steroid. So you are forced to use steroid. Similarly, now companies is because we allow the lending industry, so all the companies borrow in the billions. Everybody now has got to go borrow in billions in order to survive in the business world. And because of that, everybody is in trouble, just as all athletes are in trouble because they take steroids. So you start discussing about Schumacher talking about going back small is beautiful in the context of business environment where you allow company to grow unnaturally big using borrowed money which does not exist physically, then your discussion is actually not going to end up anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. I'd like to go to Ms. Shakira about the question on colonialism.
Thanks, Natusha. I just want to address question by Andrew on the colonial legacy, especially when you talk about economic thinking and development. I think partly is because, I mean, this is just my personal point of view. There is still a lot of colonial ideas, Western, very much driven by the Western ideas that permeates in development thinking and economic thinking. One is through the policymakers themselves, government themselves, who are very much educated or exposed to ideas that, simply said that, the Western idea of development or progress is the way to go and everything else should come for, is inferior and should follow that model. I would also say that in some ways I am complicit to that concept as well, coming from a development institution that basically espouses this idea, and it's probably why one of the reasons why I said yes, because I can be a bit critical about it, is that yes, there is that idea of having foreigners or external representatives coming and say that this is the way things should be done and then things should be developed. But I also think that in one way, at least in the case of Malaysia, there has never been a point of pause or separate that people want to say, okay, let's stop and think about and how we separate and how should we define progress and development. And I think that's quite key, even in the context of discussing about Islamic economics and Islamic economic principles, is that you have to give acknowledgement and respect to how local societies and local cultures want to think about development. And that I think has been missing in many of our conversations, whether it's with development institutions like us or even within the policymakers themselves. And that brings to the question of the exploitation, because then this idea becomes embedded, and then those who are basically those who prescribe or subscribe to this idea are the ones that are making the call, and there is no alternative to be proposed to suggest as another way of approaching economic thinking and economic issues. And I suppose I think that's my final point to this discussion is, as in our discussion about Islamic economies, principles, and all of that, is how do you make it? I mean, we acknowledge in a way that all these are universal, but how do you make it in a way that it is somewhat acceptable to all communities? And that I think everyone, Muslims and non-Muslims, have to be brought into that conversation and have an idea on what do we want in our system, in our economic system. That I think should be started, and that I think is what is missing currently. So I'm going to stop there, and then.
Thank you, Shakira. Farid, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I should say something about exploitation. That was a question you asked. But before I answer, I wanted to ask you, why did you single out Qatar and when you mentioned Saudi Arabia? What's the point of your question, actually, about exploitation? Yeah, it's an issue everywhere, right? But nothing to do with. That's why I'm not sure why you're giving an example of a Muslim majority country. The system that we live in, the economic system that we live in for the last 300 to 500 years, basically a capitalist system, a system in which, and it's very unlike how people lived before that. It's a system in which you have a tiny percentage of the population in any country, 2%, 1.5%, maybe 3%, who own capital, and everybody else has to work for salaries or wages. The vast majority of these people who work for salaries or wages work under bad conditions. Of course, how bad depends on the region of the world or the country that you live in. And the Muslim world is simply within that system. The Muslims did not invent the system. The system was created by the Europeans, and in tandem during the same period as the expansion of colonialism. The Spaniards and the Portuguese were actually looking for gold, right? Currency, and they were looking for India. That's where they thought they would find it. And this was the beginnings of, they found America accidentally, and this was the beginnings of both colonialism and capitalism. They come hand in hand. Capitalism expanded through colonial exploitation, and capitalist systems of exploitation were introduced by the Europeans, by and large, to countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And the Muslim world is no exception to that. And you don't need to go to Qatar or Saudi Arabia. It happens in Malaysia, but it happens in the US. It's everywhere. Right? So I think to me, the recognition of that fact is it's obvious. What is problematic to me is that when we talk about Islam and economics, when we talk about Christianity and economics, when we talk about Buddhism and economics, when people approach economic problems from their respective religious traditions or any other ethical tradition, we need to talk about exploitation. Otherwise, our discourse becomes an apology for the current system. You can talk till the cows come home about doing, organizing economic activities in a halal way, as do the people who run our Islamic banking and financial system. You can talk about that, or you can talk about how, when Christians speak about the economy, they talk about kindness and love and things like that. You can talk endlessly about this, but if you're not dealing with the concrete reality of economic exploitation of people, where the vast majority of people lead dreary, monotonous, routine lifestyles, and work in such a way that the whole existence of their life, most of their working life, they are working, they are living in order to work. Although we are fed the lie that we work in order to have a life. What percentage of people in any economy can actually say that they are working so that they can have a life? Most people are having a life in order to fuel the economy, in order to work. This is the modern condition. I'm not saying that pre-modern life was better. It may not be better, but it was different. We have to recognize the nature of our life in the modern economy, which is something that has been in operation for centuries. Unless we don't deal with those problems, alienation, exploitation, then Islamic economics or Christian economics or Buddhist economics becomes an apology for exploitation. And since you mentioned, talk about Muslim majority countries, Saudi Arabia, that's a good example. Islamic values on the surface, but these values or these ideas are used to promote the worst kind of capitalist, the worst kind of capitalism. In the name of religion, you have tradition being destroyed. You have old buildings, graves being destroyed in the name of religious values, because it is said that those religious sites would promote un-Islamic practices. But those sites are then replaced with the greatest icons of capitalism: 5-star, 6-star hotels, or what else? Shopping malls, and so you have a kind of parallel to Max Weber's Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, which I would call the Salafi ethic and the spirit of vulgar capitalism. And why do I say that? Because at least in Europe, for example, in Europe, in many cities, I mean, I know the city of Amsterdam, there are rules about how high you can build from the city center, from the old city center. So there's a kind of, there's a regulation to respect the old tradition. So in the city center of Amsterdam, you cannot build, you're not allowed to build skyscrapers to respect the old architecture. We don't have rules like that. Or if we do, they are not implemented. So you can build, skyscraping clock tower in Makkah, and to me that's not respecting the architectural, cultural ambience of the place. So this is what I call vulgar capitalism. So to me, Islamic economics is useless if it doesn't deal with these basic issues.
Thank you, Farid. I think that was a really salient point as well to bring up, and then it of course leads to like potential future directions for the research on Islamic economics, right? From sociological perspective, from ethnography, from education, from finance, and so forth. So since we've run out of time, actually, and I want to give Dr. Ali Salman the opportunity to respond to final remarks. And
this obsession with time in all seminars and conferences, and we have to cut short and stop, is also a capitalist value. Before capitalism, time was circular, it was endless.
It's fluid.
It was fluid. I mean, now,
Yeah.
So you see, capitalist values are invading every aspect of our lives, even when we are talking against capitalism.
Well, okay.
I'm Yunus from Turkey, PhD student here. I want to ask Dr. Ali the analogies between the old and new, because the old speaker mentioned that the capitalism became world constructed forces the last 300 years, and they changed the meaning of the market, freedom, and so many things. And also, maybe we can say that after the neoliberalism, marketizations and economizations and thinking way completely changed, and also all Muslim people directly affected this situation. And the observation is that there's so many Muslim people using the analogies. For instance, the big companies say that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the good merchant businessman. Therefore, we should be good businessmen. And also saying that Islam has to write the property rights and this kind of the things. Therefore, I'm trying to say that creating the legitimizations going back to the neoliberal policies or capitalist system using the Islamic principles. That means the Islamic principle, instrumentalizations, the systems, and today is the Islamic finance, banking systems, using this kind of the principles to legitimize, to justify itself. And my question is that means you provide the meaning of the market, freedom, and some basic concepts, but this concept is not the stable, not the fixed, and the changing the time to time. And Prof. Farid mentioned that exploitation and alienations come from the capitalist systems. And this one became the more complex and more strategic in the capitalist systems. And my question is that how to provide also, how to solve this kind of the analogies, because so many people using this kind of the analogies justify themselves.
Okay. Thank you for that question. I'll quickly respond to it, but I'll also respond to some of the comments by respected panelists. I think just to answer that question, I am not trying to create an apology or an analogy between these systems using my understanding of the economic organization of Islamic society. I'm not doing that. So in my work, I have just tried to present a framework of how the economic and institutions evolved and practiced and established in a particular time of our history, how then it influenced the later generations and later centuries of Islamic civilization. So that is my that is my case. So I've already explained. So I'm not using it as a prelude to support capitalism or communism as far as this field of study is concerned. So that's very clear. But you're right. This is being done across many disciplines, but I do not support that. I hope that point is clear. Now, I want to spend a few minutes on on what actually Professor Farid has mentioned about the wealth, about capitalism, about exploitation, because I think this is heart of the matter. Really, this is the heart of the matter. I'm actually in a process of writing sort of an additional essay in the same framework, which hopefully, inshallah, in next edition, which is on the idea of social justice. This is part of the work which is commissioned by an institute in a university in UK, where they are comparing social justice principles across different religious traditions. So I've been asked to look at it from the Islamic notions. But I think that in that way I will be able to maybe address the issue of exploitation maybe more, but I'll use that reflection also in expanding that, because I think when you talk about exploitation, the corresponding idea is of social justice, and how do we maintain that people who have not the opportunities, let's say endowments, are able to achieve some degree of economic outcomes, if not equality. I think my personal position is, frankly, I would like to defend capitalism very clearly. This is my personal position. And why I would say that, you see, the issue of wealth creation that we talk about today, and the issue, let's say, the kind of lives we live today, it's of course not a perfect life. It's not a very, there are a lot of injustices. There are a lot of inequalities that come with the kind of structure, the kind of societies, the kind of families we are born, and we do not have much choices about it. So a lot of the economic outcome is determined by where we live, where we are born, what kind of state we live in. So that is not in our control. So there are those differences. But generally speaking, I think the process of wealth creation is a result of a capitalist structure of the economy, in which we have seen the role of not just labor. Obviously, I understand that the labor class has been truly exploited 18th, 19th, 20th century, even today. But I would like to, I think you agree with that, Professor Farid, that the situation of the material condition of the situation with labor in 19th century, 20th century is different. So after the labor movements, especially after 1920s, 30s, when the labor rights were clearly established, things improved a lot. And if you ask, let's say, a working class today, I'm sure they would like to live in a society which offers more and a higher level of income, rather than societies which offer less level of income, even though they not be able to achieve that level of, let's say, the wealth. So even the labor would like to live in relatively rich societies to actually make better opportunities. So that means it's very clear. And there are institutions, of course, which it's not the labor itself. It's although the entrepreneur, the risk taker, the innovator, which have played a very, very important role in the creation of the wealth itself. So when I mention, I think Professor Farid mentioned about the difference between the production system and the wealth creation system. I would like to equate the two, and I would say that although in that time, of course, trade and agriculture was the main instrument of the wealth creation, but the process was the same. Process was the same in the sense where, let's say, how the wealth was created. Okay, like the trade caravans were traveling afar for months, buying some commodities, taking the metals from Arab, bringing spices from the east, bringing into bazaar, and that will involve significant amount of risk of capital. Remember how Meccans used to trade? They used to take the capital from those who were residents of the city, kind of a venture capital, and then those traders would travel to China, to India, to Malaya, and then they would take the products back, right? So they were using other capitals, and then there were sort of risks, like this was predetermined, okay, how much profit you will incur, or loss sharing arrangement was there. So this kind of process has been there for centuries. Obviously the products change, the evolutions, the institution change. Continue my chain of thought. I mean, even the post-scarcity society, let's say, like to take that example of a futuristic society, it's like an historical outcome, right? So it's a historical outcome of significant material development which we have experienced over last 200 centuries. Significant material development, the abundance of products, the abundance of food, the abundance of other products we have. Yes, there are issues in maybe distribution. We all acknowledge that. But then this is also an issue of control. So I think even the post-scarcity society cannot be achieved by avoiding this mode of production, which we all live today. I think that is also we just need to acknowledge that. In that sense, I think the process of wealth creation is central to the process of let's say the economic development and the prosperity overall. And I think that is closer to the society we are living in today. I'm sorry, I'm lost my chain of thoughts here. And to conclude, yeah, I would say that this is, when we talk about the, let's say the institution of free trade and open trade, if we take that as an example, now it has been used in last 100 years of say for both countries in the north and countries in the south. Now, if Malaysia does not enjoy free trade access to, let's say, US market or European market, it would not have achieved this level of economic development. So yes, it's a part of a global value chain. Yes, you're right that, okay, here we do not see much of innovation, but we see maybe a part of supply chain integration. When we talk about electronics, we do have this contribution of educated labor, working class. But then ultimately, we cannot deny that Malaysia has achieved this level of economic development by being a participant, an active participant of global capitalism. And I think that needs to be recognized. Of course, we need to move on. We need to invest further in human development. No one is stopping us from improving the education standards. Even now, talking about the working hours, or energy. So let's take two examples: the move towards renewable, the issue of global warming. So which countries are moving ahead and faster on 100% carbon neutral arrangement? This will be the Western economies like Germany, like Switzerland. They are moving much faster on that scale. Which countries are able to offer reduced working hours, or at least talking about reduced working hours from 5 days to 4 days to 3 days? UK or European countries, right? So there is, of course, a historical process which they are experiencing, but they could not have probably achieved at that or even arrived at this level of development without undergoing that process of history. So I think that is where I come from. So I think we should all acknowledge that and also critically look at both the institutions and as well as the theory to help us better understand the development. Thank you so much again for your presence in such a moment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali, for the final words. Unfortunately, because of capitalism, we have to wrap up. But please continue the conversation. There are some refreshments outside. And before we make an official closing, I would like to be at Islam and Liberty Network and with Gerak Budaya would like to offer our speakers a token of appreciation.